That's brilliant. So I think we'd be remiss if we didn't speak about one of the enemies that Karl Popper speaks about, Karl Marx, and of course by extension Hegel, Engels, etc. I don't even know how to frame this question. There's so much to talk about when discussing Marx. So maybe just to restrict and perhaps to put the conversation about Marx in context, we can talk about him in the context of an open society. And maybe not get into so much the technical economic errors that are littered across his writings. But what is it about him that makes Popper declare him an enemy of the open society?
Marx does not recognize the role of each of us in the emergent social order that is our society. He believes that society is driven by a deeper mechanism, sometimes called the substrata in this literature. And it is an abstract idea. It's the method of production, as he calls it. This method of production is really in charge. You and I are just actors on the stage. He says it beautifully in his book called the 18th Brumaire of Napoleon, in which he says, we make our history, but we do not make it just so. So you and I have choices, but our choices are radically restricted by the logic of our era. Now, if our era is feudalism, that's one. If our logic is the period of guilds, that restricts us in a different way. If it's the Roman Empire, it restricts us in a different way. But he says it's not. He doesn't deny that we exercise choice. He just says your choice is a footnote. The real business is the logic of the society in which you live, which is why, by the way, he doesn't blame capitalists in the 19th century for the evident hard circumstances of the working class, for example, in London, which he saw at first hand when he was working in London. So it's true that there was a period of capitalism in the 19th century that had really harsh consequences for the workers in those industrializing factories of the 19th century. He doesn't blame the capitalists at all. He says, he says the capitalists are only playing their role in the bigger movement of history. It's not that they're moral. He says they're neither moral nor immoral. They're just playing their role. It's what he says, that they make their decisions, but they don't make it just so. So he believes that this movement of the system of production is really in charge, and it's moved forward through his mechanism of class conflict. So we will move on in the period of feudalism for a while until the inherent contradictions in feudalism cause the peasants to rise up and hit the dukes over the head, and then we'll move out of feudalism into something new, proto-capitalism, for example. And then the capitalists are in charge until the point where the laborers rise up and hit the capitalists over their head, and then in his case, in his prediction, we would have emerged in a socialist or communist society in which there are no more fundamental contradictions, and then history would stop. History in that sense, history as the movement of this underlying system of production, this great idea, would stop. So why is Popper against it? Because you can see that everything that I've just said is theorizing at the level of society. It says that what is in charge is this underlying force, and we are really just actors in a bigger play. We might have the delusion of autonomy, but we don't really. In fact, the worst thing we can do is to try to act against the machine. So Marx reserves his greatest scorn, not for capitalists. He reserves his greatest scorn for what he called democratic socialists. That's what we would call the center left in the 19th century. People who thought, let's use a bit of legislation to give better circumstances for laborers in factories. These are, of course, we now know, excellent ideas. A great contribution for the left in the course of the last 150 years has been precisely this. Let's take the rough edges off industrialization. He said that's the worst thing that you can do, because what do? Is you act against the force of history. So you might delay the crisis that will bring the actually good society to come, communism. So he calls them the most reactionary of all forces in society, as the democratic socialists, the center left, the soft lefties of the 19th century. He really hates them because they are going to frustrate his revolution. He's very happy for thousands, even millions of people to die in the revolution because he believes they are purely instrumental to get us to the point of the good society that is to come.
Yeah.
And he really believes that if you act in for humanitarian reasons to soften the edges of capitalism, you're anti-revolutionary and you're a great opponent of society. So his theorizing is at the level of the society, and remember that's what Popper says is precisely an irrational approach.
Yeah.
And indeed, I believe Marx's theorizing about history and the movement of history is entirely wrong. It is an entirely misguided approach to the social sciences. It's inherently unscientific. It is a purely ideological expression. And of course you can if you look backwards, of course you can fit the data points to your story.
Yeah.
Any ideologue can do that. It is of no consequence that you can tell a story that matches your ideological perspective. But it doesn't stand up to critical scrutiny. None of what Marx says in his historical analysis stands up to modern historiography. So his broad brush history of the decline of empires, the decline of feudalism, none of that stacks up to modern historiography. None of it describes the actual reason for the transition away from those societies. So we know it was bad history, it was bad social science, and ultimately it was a very bad way of trying to plan in a forward direction the new society that they wanted to see.
Yeah, and I think another very interesting quarrel that Popper has with Marx in the book is the proclivity for violence that the ideology has, which Marx himself was unable to disregard as being essential to the achievement of the kind of society that he wishes to see. And I think that's very interesting that even he himself was unable to rule out the role that violence would play in the unfolding events of history.
Great revolutionaries often do it. The first was Abbé Sieyès in the French Revolution. So remember, he's a prominent church leader in the French Revolution. And Sieyès said, if you want to make an omelette, you mustn't be afraid to break a few eggs.
Yeah.
And if you're so persuaded of the society, the utopian society that you think you are creating, then you are indeed willing to sacrifice a few people along the way. By the way, you are very rarely willing to sacrifice yourself.
Yeah.
But you're quite willing to sacrifice some other people. And that is, as you know, as I've already told you, that is what shocked Popper as a young man in Vienna. He couldn't believe that fellow students would be willing to disregard the death of one of their friends for this abstract argument. Yeah. Now, Marx, on the other hand, perfectly willing to do so. It's instrumental. And why is it instrumental? Because people don't really matter in the story. What matters is this great arc of history that he thinks he has uncovered.
Yeah.
If you read Russian novels of the 20th century, like Dr. Zhivago, for example, the Red Army General Strelnikov says it beautifully when he pulls Dr. Zhivago onto the train. He criticizes Zhivago. He says, "Oh yeah, I know about you. You're the guy that writes that bourgeois poetry." And Zhivago says, "But what could possibly be offensive about that? These are love poems and so on." And he says, "The problem is precisely these private interests." And then the wonderful sentence he says, "The private life is dead in Russia. History has killed it." And then Zhivago says, "You, Strelnikov, exterminated a town 5 miles down the track."
Sure.
And Strelnikov says, "Of course, they stole horses for the whites, the opponents of the Red Army." And Zhivago says, "You got the wrong village. It wasn't them." Strelnikov says, "That's of no consequence." He says, "Horses are stolen, a village is burnt, the point is made." And that really is a beautiful expression of exactly that kind of logic within the novel. That's why these novels are so powerful, because they give us a demonstration of the moral consequences of these theories. And in fact, Dostoevsky does the same in Brothers Karamazov and in Crime and Punishment. He says, what I'm going to do with the novel is I'm going to play out the consequences of ideas. Let me show you what happens in human society if you really believe this stuff. And indeed, Pasternak did that with Dr. Zhivago as well. And that's, I strongly recommend it to our listeners as well. If you really want to see the consequences of trying to command society at the total level, read Dr. Zhivago. Read the literature of the novelists who actually lived through it. Solzhenitsyn is another nice example of the same.
Geez, that was hugely insightful. And I think perhaps what Popper does so well in the book, he doesn't just talk about violence in a silo, he grounds it in democracy. And I think democracy is an awfully important concept, even for the rest of the conversation going forward. And I think it's the scorn with which Marx teaches his followers to look at democracy. Because, as Engels points out, in reality, the state is nothing more than the machine of the oppression of one class by another. And that holds for a democratic republic no less than for a monarchy. And that to me seems to aid and abet those who are diametrically opposed to the democratic system. And it seems to me that that's so counterproductive, because it's democracy that is going to help people get out of the destitution that they're in. But what Marx and Engels teach is for people to look at democracy with so much scorn so as to destroy their only hopes and their only possibility to escape poverty.
Of course, he wouldn't want a democracy because he has uncovered the actual mechanism of society. And so if you believe that hubris, that you've already uncovered it, what on earth could the contribution of the democratic system be? In fact, you must absolutely prevent it, because the people might vote incorrectly. And that's counter-revolutionary, right? That's what he said about the democratic socialists. People might just make a mistake. No, the crucial thing is to uncover the movement of history on a scientific basis. That was this bizarre obsession with Marxism and Leninism in the Soviet Union, which justified their totalitarian state too. So our great leaders, Stalin, so Lenin first and then Stalin, they have brilliantly uncovered the system. No voting could possibly add anything to this. The crucial point is to follow in the predictions. Now, when we talk about democracy in Popper, we must just be clear about an important point. By democracy, he does not mean that all decisions in society should be put up to the popular vote.
Like majoritarianism.
He absolutely does not. He believes, in fact, something close to the opposite of that. He's really a Republican. He gets his inspiration from the ancient Roman Republic. It is a republic of laws, not of men and women. We live in a society in that kind of republic where we live in a society where we do vote for leaders, but those leaders have very restricted ability to affect the outcomes for society. In the Roman Republic, most famously, 2 consuls were voted with veto power over each other, so that there wasn't even one top guy in the Roman Republic. Now, Popper says in The Open Society, he says the real question of political philosophy is not who should rule. It's, given that we select a ruler, how can we design institutions to prevent the ruler from ruining our lives? Mm-hmm. And that's the real question of political philosophy. So he says, of course, we must use the democratic mechanism to elect rulers, but we use democracy in a limited way. We use it collectively to decide on the rules under which we will live, and we use it collectively to pick our leaders in a representative democracy. But we do not think that every decision ought to be put up to the vote. The Lord Acton that I referred to at the beginning of our podcast said the same thing. He says, democracy is the truest friend of freedom, or its most unrelenting foe, according as it is mixed or pure. The American founding fathers did the same thing in the 18th century. They did, for them, the question when they wrote their constitution in 1788 was precisely whether they would emerge with a democracy. There was great enthusiasm for it along the model of the French Revolution, and in fact, the democracy of the French Revolution is what leads you to the terror of the French Revolution, or a republic, which is a society of laws, not of rule by the mob. And eventually, they emerged with a republic, and they were very concerned about whether it would last, because since the Roman Republic of 2,500 years ago, The only republic that we had an example of that had any substantial history was the Venetian Republic, a city-state, and the political thinkers at the time really thought that you could only have a republic in a small state. And so a continent-wide state like the US couldn't be a republic. And so they emerged with this experiment. When they left the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin was asked by a reporter, who was a female correspondent, and she said, "Mr. Franklin, do we have a republic?" And his response was, "Yes, madam, if you can keep it." They really doubted whether people would sign up to this restriction on the power of democracy. And that really is a crucial part of the insight in the open society too, is democracy is a crucial part of this rational system that we call the open society, the system where we can collectively reflect on what we are doing, but we don't reflect on the entire society. If we put everything in society up to the democratic process, we will in fact end up with a despotism of the mob, just like what happened in the second half of the French Revolution.
That's very, very interesting. And I think maybe to extend this conversation about democracy and the Constitution